So here we are. We are finishing up this class. And in fact, this week is really laid back. It's reflective on the entire course. And then next week is the final, which is not going to be that difficult. It's going to be a paper. It's 25 points. And it'll be due by Thursday of next week, and it'll be done. And I'm going to catch up on a lot of grading this week. Anything I've been behind on, or look over your grades, whatever. But we do have some work for this week, and it's again. I wanted to just do a recap over what we've learned and the importance of Western civilization, and to kind of really remind us of things that I talked about in this class that I want to really reinforce into your brain. So, to say somebody is Western implies a geographic location, right? But what we really have to keep in mind is that what we're also talking about is nations that are not geographically located in the West, but are rooted in Western civilization. Okay? And that's what we covered in this class, which is also a little different than nations that are influenced by Western civilization. One could argue that most nations now are at least influenced by Western civilization, but at the same time, one can argue that Western civilization, well, as we talked about with ancient Egypt, and if you look at Greece, that's really in the Mediterranean. Western civilization is also influenced by Africa, the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern culture. Like there's, right, when we look at the origins and the foundations of Western civilization, many things that we think of as Western are not in the non-Western world, and many people from the non-Western world are influenced by us. But over time, in the history that we just covered, we do develop certain things that are very distinct to what we're thinking of when we're talking about Western civilization. But also what we forget sometimes is how many things that we have in common are similar. So, right, I mean, Western Europeans were tribal. We had clans, and we were decentralized. We had ancestral gods, we were pagan. Our ancestors, those of us of Germanic and Celtic and Slavic descent, our ancestors worshipped sacred trees. We had bogs, rocks, lakes, things of that nature that were considered sacred to our ancestors. In similar ways that we see with Aboriginals, of people, indigenous First Nations people of other areas. So African society, when you look at, let's say, a Zulu tribe, one could argue that a Germanic tribe had a lot of things in common in terms of structure and so on. And I think it's also important to realize then, right, that when Rome as the driving force that kind of brought civilization in other words, the barbarians were those of us of basically white folk ancestry I just talked about, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic, and some elements you could say Turkic come this way, but Indo-European peoples, that Rome calling them barbarian, that was a derogatory term. That was the non-politically correct term for people outside of Rome. And then as Rome and the Roman model from the pagan phase to the Christian phase ends up dominating, its presence, its legacy, so powerful into the world, that the Germanic people and the Celtic people and the Slavic people are eventually going to look negatively at our own ancestral beginnings and to think lower of the pagan self. There's going to be conversions, many times by force, And the Roman legacy, the Greco-Roman legacy, to even be more precise, ends up being celebrated at the expense of the history that we think of ourselves. And then as European states started developing and exploration and discovering other nations that were in a state of paganism, decentralized, all those things that our ancestors were in our barbarian phase, as you will, ended up being seen as barbarians as well, as heathen, as people that are in need of conversion, subjugation, and certainly do not have a right to control their own resources. In other words, the very land that I'm talking to you on here, those of us in the United States, those of us from Central America and South America and Canada, our nations exist at the expense of those who were the original inhabitants, at least the original inhabitants for quite some time. That goes for New Zealand, for Australia, that goes for, you get my point, right? The West didn't come by peace, came by the sword. And I think that we have a hard time sucking that in and absorbing that. The majority of the world that's Christian is Christian because of the sword. Now, there were missionaries that converted people, but it was political power that enabled it to be a real presence in the world. And Islam does the same thing. One can argue that there was the missionary activities that are nonviolent and that actually persuade people to believe in something. And then there's the sheer power of military might, and also the lack of opportunities given if you don't convert. And look what happened to Iceland. If you remember, in the year 1000, that the king of Norway, who was Christian, told small Iceland that if everybody there doesn't convert to Christianity, that they will basically be cut off. They will suffer. And when there was a vote, the leaders of the pagan community said, can't sustain ourselves like this. We'll convert. And then there was an agreement that it was a don't ask, don't tell policy, basically. Okay, well, if you do paganism from your house, we're not going to really examine it, but you need to convert to Christianity and we'll all be officially Christian. And so a vote was made due to political pressure that made Iceland become Christian. And it's hard for us to often absorb that because we like to not. Many of us want a more romantic version about how things took place, but that's how many parts of the world went. And remember, we talked about Charlemagne annihilating several thousand, almost 4,000 pagans for not worshiping Jesus. Again, that's a product of Europe, of a Western civilization. At the same time, literature, art, architecture, eventually creating more, having a democratic republic and even weakening the monarchies, having kind of parliamentary systems with monarchies in place. There are going to be many, many things that the West does that the world will take pause to and will be seen as progressive in terms of human development. Slavery is a global thing, and the West is surely not the only ones to ever do slavery. The irony is that the West is going to be a major part of the slave trade movement, but at the same time we are going to see an intellectual currents that actually questions slavery in a way that hasn't been questioned in the past as well. Essentially, there's a lot of contradictions and paradoxes to our civilization that we are trying to resolve. Now, here's what's really been happening. Western civilization, even though understood to be the dominant force politically and culturally in the world, is taking a huge hit of criticism from many, many people. Many people from non-Western backgrounds, even if they've lived for a long time in Western nations. So Why is this the case? Well, many nationalists and conservatives bemoan this as a kind of a conspiracy almost, and then you have the white nationalists and the ultra-nationalists that are much more blunt about this idea of what their criticism of why this is the case. Essentially, much more of the West now has people in it that are people of color, that are people who are byproducts of Western imperialism and colonialism and domination. And so the way that they are reading the history is different. For people who are indigenous, for natives here, I mentioned this in some of my other lectures, I've made friends up here in Portland. There's a lot more of a presence of people who are Native American, American Indian background. And many of them, frankly, just see white Canada and white United States as the thieves of their land and their culture. They never, they were here. They don't act like, they don't hate us, but they loathe the idea that Western civilization is something that's supposed to be considered good and noble when it was what destroyed their own people. And it is still destroying. I mean, like in the North Dakota, and the water protectors issues there, they all see this as that as nothing's ever changed. And you see in Western Europe the same thing. You have a lot more people now coming in who are have been on a different end of Western civilization, and then some people just coming in who just don't actually see a value in it in the way that those in the past did. And one could argue that there's a certain lack of confidence in the West. I would argue this, that World War I is where we would actually see where this started. Now, that's for my 105 class that we talk about, but just to say, in World War I, Europeans, I mean, we took the whole world in, but Europeans themselves saw themselves slaughter each other in a way that they didn't do even back in the past. Modern technology and weaponry made the trench warfare and the bomb situation and all of this to be a much more horrifying set of circumstances. Then World War II just escalated, and here we were supposed to be the light of the world. And then the Soviet Union falls. So the fascist ideology and the communist ideologies kind of lost their popularity for the moment. And then we're left with liberal democracy and capitalism, which isn't, to be honest, is not really doing so well either. So the West is kind of in a sort of decay, but where's the options? What other avenues? This is how a lot of people see things. So then conservatives for us want to make America great again, or want to make Europe great again. They want to go back to the past in the same way that some political movements of Islam are doing. Because in a sense, what's happened now is that there is again a lack of confidence for the future. There's not a strong sense of destiny in a positive way about where the West is going now. But we do see this kind of resurgence of far-right white nationalism, European nationalist movements that are wanting to reassert that confidence. But to do that, they have to do what our original ancestors did to get here. If we're going to go back to Western dominance and confidence in the way that they want, then there has to be a removal, a demotion of those who are not of Western descent. And many are calling for things like ethnic cleansing. We live in a very troubling times, not necessarily more troubling than other times. That's the thing we learn about history, but we have our own unique set of problems. And we have a technology that's developed in a way that also is different than that we had in the past. But in any case, I think that it's fair to say that on the whole there is a love-hate relationship with the West that's not going away. And that I hope that you will love to learn about Western history, Western civilization, Eastern, American, African. the more we study history, the better informed we're going to be on trying to figure out how to resolve so many things that are a problem right now, and we'll at least not be duped by political demagogues that speak in the name of the left or the right or in between. I'd hope that's the case that we can do. Now, I am, having said all the things I said, I'm having you watch a man speak, a documentary that celebrates the West from a man who I respect and kind of love to hate. And I'll just let you know, Neil Ferguson is not my politics. Perhaps I shouldn't have outed myself like that with him. But he's quality. He's a really quality source, and he's a guy who has confidence in Western civilization. When I say quality, he knows a lot. I mean, he is an academic that, for the most part, I've never heard him say wrong information. He has an interpretations about that information that I don't always agree with. But that's just me. Now, you might find it to be different. You might love what he has to say. My colleagues, we have debates about him. He's kind of controversial within my circle of historian friends, just to let you know. So this gives you an opportunity to join in that discussion, and I will really enjoy whatever you have to say. So you know by now with me that I don't grade based on your politics, but I want you to engage with the topics. Okay? So if there's any other questions, try to get a hold of me. I'll try to be more available this week, and I should be able to be a little bit more focused than I've been these last 2 weeks. And so here we go, and we're almost done.